So this is Mel Duncan. I'm the Research Director at AGREE, and I want to welcome you to this webinar on federal agricultural spending. This is the first in a series of background papers that AGREE will be releasing over the next several months. And our idea about the backgrounders is that they will inform debates as we look at future directions for food and ag policy with our partners, and also lay the groundwork for a common understanding of the issues and policies that are going to be involved in formulating a new policy framework. We're very happy to have with us Stephanie Mercier, who's worked with AGREE on several pieces over the last few months. Stephanie is the former chief economist for the Senate Ag Committee and knows farm programs and farm spending well. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Stephanie. Stephanie will speak for about an hour, and then we'll have a half an hour for questions. Thanks very much. Stephanie.
Hey, thank you very much for the introduction, Bill, and let me get started on the presentation. Bring it through. Okay. I was asked in the course of preparing this presentation to pull together information about where does the federal money on agriculture go, in what directions, on what types of programs, and who actually benefits. And so this PowerPoint presentation will go through some of the details on each of those topics. I'm going to click through pretty quickly some slides that are just background on the process and AGREE itself. And I'm going to get started talking about the budget process that the U.S. Congress goes through. Starting in 1974 with the passage of the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, Congress established specific rules that govern the federal budget process. Thus, on an annual basis, both houses are supposed to develop, reconcile, and adopt a budget reconciliation that establishes the framework for that next year's budget process. This document is not actually signed by the President, so it doesn't have the force of law, but it does govern how Congress proceeds in the budget process. And then based on the budget resolution, each appropriations subcommittee is assigned an overall funding figure for the programs under its jurisdiction for the coming fiscal year. Unfortunately, Congress has not been very good in the last 2 years on actually getting a budget resolution done, but that's how the process is supposed to work. Under what are called pay-go rules, each appropriations subcommittee is supposed to find what are called offsets that represent either reduced spending on certain programs or increased revenues in order to fund any new program. We're operating on a somewhat different set of rules in the current Congress, which is 112. When the Republicans took control of the House, they changed the pay-go rule to what they now call cut-go, which means that only spending cuts now count as offsets, that new revenue does not. So it's the House and Senate are actually working under different sets of rules. Annually funded programs which come out of this process are also known as discretionary funding or discretionary programs. That is, the discretionary is one category of programs, and then another one is what we call mandatory programs. And these are established on a long-term basis by the committee's jurisdiction, and payments are generally made to anyone who qualifies without overall restrictions on an annual basis. The largest programs in this category make up what we call the social safety net in the United States. It includes such programs as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the domestic nutrition programs, which include food stamps and school lunch programs. The category also includes agricultural programs such as farm support and crop insurance programs. These are also known very popularly as entitlement programs. And this chart shows you what the big components of the federal budget are in a given year. This is for fiscal 2011, which just finished about a month and a half ago on September 30th of 2011. As you can see from the chart, mandatory programs make up about 57% of spending. The next biggest chunk is defense spending, which is about 19%. Next chunk is non-defense discretionary, which is essentially everything else. And then the little blue sliver at the top is net interest paid on the federal debt. So that's essentially the big picture, the big categories of federal spending. We've had a very radical change in the outlook of federal spending in the last decade or so. Between 1998 and 2001, a combination of a strong economy, tax increases, and spending cuts actually led to the first multi-year federal budget we had in this country since 1949. And over the 3-year period, 1998 through 2001, we actually had about $560 billion in surplus, which is kind of unheard of these days. Since 2001, however, we've gone from CBO projecting a 10-year surplus of $5 trillion to a 10-year deficit of $7 trillion. And it's been a combination of both economic forces and policy decisions that led to this turnaround. And this is a figure that was prepared by a group called the Center on Budget Policy Priorities. And it shows what they project to be the main sources of the expected budget deficit we'll have in this country over the next 10 or 20 years. And so if you look at the chart, the biggest section of it is at the bottom. The blue section are the Bush-era tax cuts that were passed in 2001 and 2003. The yellow section in the middle are the costs, continuing costs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This will have to be adjusted, obviously, because we are finally getting out of Iraq at the end of this year. The green section in the middle is the costs, the economic impacts of the recession that started in the late 2007, both the decline in economic output, which led to a reduction in revenue, and then on the other side, higher expenditures on some of the safety net programs. And then the very small blue sliver that you can barely see was the cost of the TARP and the Freddie and Fannie bailouts. And then the purplish chunk up at the top is the cost of the 2009 stimulus package. The one piece that CBP chose not to put on this that is actually part of this array of costs is the cost of the Medicare Part D, the prescription drug program, because they didn't feel confident they knew what the long-term outlook for that was, so they chose to leave it off the graph. But I think you can see here that a lot of the stuff that is making up this deficit was in place long before Barack Obama became president. And some of our economic forces, some of our decisions that were made in the last couple of administrations. And so earlier this year we had a very significant and contentious debate over something called the debt ceiling. And this is something that was imposed in 1917, so almost 100 years ago, as part of the Second Liberty Bond Act, which provided funds for the expenses of the First World War. According to what I could find, there's only one other country in the world, developed country at least, that has a similar kind of setup, and that's Denmark. No other countries have the kind of limitation that the debt ceiling represents. According to the Congressional Research Service, the debt ceiling was raised 74 times between 1962 and 2010, and mostly it was a very routine act. However, the current GOP leadership and others saw this as threatening a possible breach of the debt ceiling as a prime opportunity to impose dramatic cuts on federal spending and reshape the roles of the federal program. This was very much a brinkmanship effort, and the bill that they agreed to was finally signed only 10 hours before essentially the federal government would have gone into default. So it was kind of harrowing. What we ended up with on August 2nd of 2011 was something called the Budget Control Act. It set up a two-stage process that is still ongoing. The first was that it imposed caps on discretionary spending for the next 10 years, saving an estimated $917 billion. And then second is this new super committee process, whereby which 12 members from the House and the Senate are charged with identifying an additional $1.2 trillion in savings or increased revenue to reduce the deficit over the next 10 years. All of the committees were given the ability to make recommendations to the super committee, and they were supposed to be provided to the super committee by mid-October. That process would not have had explicit cuts to foreign programs in that $917 billion tranche, but there were changes, would have been cuts to the discretionary programs that USDA runs. And the next part of this presentation, I'm going to go through some of the items that make up federal spending in the three goal areas that agree as enunciated. And let me first of all talk about some of the caveats of the analysis that I did. All the data that I cite in this presentation are an average of spending over fiscal 2007 through 2011, and then was adjusted for inflation. I'm pretty confident of the data that I got for fiscal 07 through fiscal 10 because every agency has to provide a very lengthy budget document to Congress to do the appropriations process. So that's pretty solid data. The fiscal 2011 data I'm a little shakier on because part of it because we didn't actually get a bill done until April 2011, which is 7 months into the fiscal year, and the agencies just didn't get around to providing program level data for a lot of the stuff that are in here. so there's some extrapolation that I had to do, and then to the extent that we had mandatory programs, I had to extrapolate data on that to compare it to previous year spending. There was additional funding provided for some of these programs under the stimulus bill, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Those were not included in the categories that I'm presenting in this presentation, and I used the Consumer Price Index to do the adjusting for inflation. So AGREE goal number 1 is enunciated as an effort to improve agricultural productivity, food security, and environmental performance at both the national and global levels. And for the purpose of the presentation, the relevant programs we'll be looking at include the Farm Safety Net programs, conservation programs, environmental programs and the oversight of the national environment, trade promotion programs, and agricultural productivity research and extension. Let's start out with what do the numbers look like. On an inflation-adjusted basis, federal spending in this category averaged about $31 billion over that period. And there's a different way of looking at it as well. A lot of the programs in this area are loan programs as opposed to direct spending. And so CBO actually has this very special way of accounting for loan programs in its budgets. A program level will tell you how much the agency in question can actually lend under the program. So, for example, a program might be able to lend a total of $5 billion, and that's considered program level. But the actual cost that gets assessed to the budget is a very different number. It's essentially what CBO determines is the expected cost of the federal government of those programs, and what it essentially is their estimation of the likelihood of default in aggregate for that program for the year. So the budget score and the program level for the loan programs are very different numbers. And the data I provided in this analysis will look at both. Goal number 1 accounts for about 26% of overall spending on ag-related federal programs that I was able to identify, and 98% of that total comes in USDA programs. First of all, let's look at the Farm Safety Net programs. Most of those occur with the through the Farm Service Agency. Keep in mind that these are 5-year averages rather than recent estimates, but we're talking about the direct payment program, which has averaged about $4.8 billion over the last 5 years. Both the countercyclical and the acre payment programs is about $1.1 billion. The marketing loan program and the benefits from that are about $1.5 billion. And then farm loan programs, talk about the 2 different ways of assessing it. It's been about $4.2 billion in loan levels or program levels, but the budgetary cost has been under $200 million. Next category is disaster assistance, which is $1.5 billion, and that consists of both ad hoc programs from earlier and also the permanent disaster programs such as SURE and related programs that were part of the 2008 Farm Bill. And then the last category is other programs and activities, which is about $2 billion, and most of that is the tobacco buyout program. And then the second major agency and program that sits under this category is the Federal Crop Insurance Program, which is run by the Risk Management Agency, and the average cost of that over the last 5 years has been about $5.5 billion. And this chart takes a look at inflation-adjusted total farm support spending over the last almost 50 years. And as you can see, it's a lot of variability there. The peaks generally occur when there's a decline in farm prices or farm exports, and you have a lot of countercyclical spending going on. And so you saw peaks back in the 80s. You saw more peaks in the early 1990s. You saw a huge one in the early 2000s after we had a big financial recession in Asia that drove down exports and market prices. And then since then, you've seen a pretty steady decline. So it's very much of a cyclical pattern. The next category under goal number 1 are the conservation environmental programs, and a lot of those are run out of the National Resources Conservation Service. Biggest one is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, which provides assistance, cost share assistance to farmers at the farm level for them to adopt new practices. That's just under $1 billion a year at $925 million. Second program in that category is the Conservation Stewardship Program, which is similarly but more focused on actual resources rather than specifically on practices, and that's averaged about $426 million over the last 5 years. And then there's a number of programs and activities at the Forest Service that fit under this category, with an average of $5.4 billion. And then at the Farm Service Agency, biggest program there is the Conservation Reserve Program, which allows farmers to set aside environmentally sensitive land, especially highly erosive land, keep it out of production, and then they get a rental payment in exchange. And that's been roughly $2.2 billion on average over the last 5 years. And then there's a handful of programs outside of USDA which fit into this category, for a total of about $550 million. A lot of that occurs at the Environmental Protection Agency. Included in that category are the efforts that they do to license the commercial pesticides that are used in the United States. And then they also have specific programs that address environmental issues in regions of the United States, such as in the Great Lakes region or the Chesapeake Bay. And then the second non-USDA agency that has programs in this category are the range management programs at the Bureau of Land Management. The major conservation programs, especially the ones I listed here, are mandatory programs because of the way they're funded, but they're either capped based on acres or annual funding. So in that sense, they're not true entitlement programs. And here's a sort of a summary of some of the other activities under goal number 1. And one of those areas is agricultural productivity research. Biggest set of programs there are those at USDA at about $1.4 billion, and then the National Science Foundation has a program on plant genome research at about $86 million. And then the second smaller category are the trade promotion programs, which are primarily the GSM export credit program, again, where you have both program level and budget. And then I also have smaller programs such as the market access program at $200 million a year. And then there's some ag-related export promotion and credit guarantee programs at other agencies, much smaller in magnitude, especially since at OPIC and the Ex-Im Bank, those programs are funded through fees for the credits and various activities and don't receive direct appropriations. But there's very small levels of spending there, so I wanted to include them for purposes of being comprehensive. And here's a chart which sort of breaks down the components of federal spending under this goal. And keep in mind that these is a 5-year average and not necessarily recent years, but farm safety net programs accounts for about 55% of the total under this goal, and that includes crop insurance. Conservation programs accounts for about 38%. Ag productivity research about 5%, and then trailing at the end is about 2% for the trade promotion programs. Okay, the second category is agreed goal number 2, which is those programs that are aimed at increasing the availability of and access to nutritious foods. The relevant programs in this category include the domestic nutrition assistance programs, food safety inspection and oversight, international food assistance programs, and nutrition and food safety research and extension. And on an inflation-adjusted basis, programs associated with goal number 2 account for 65%, so it's a really big chunk of what we do. And the major programs under the category of domestic nutrition programs are the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which until 2008 was known as food stamps, and that is an average of about $48 billion over the last 5 years. Participation has spiked a lot in that program since the 2008-2009 recession. It received a temporary boost in benefits under the 2009 stimulus bill, but the numbers in this analysis don't include the increases under that act. Also in this category are the child nutrition programs, which is mainly the school lunch, school breakfast programs, averaged $15.5 billion over the last 5 years. But almost 32 million children participated in the school lunch program in fiscal 2011. Third program in this category is the Women, Infants, and Children program, or WIC, and that was about $6.4 billion over that period. And then there's a number of smaller programs and also administrative costs, which is about $500 million. And this is a chart that shows you the dramatic increase that we've seen under the SNAP or food stamp program in the last 2 years. And this, the 2011 at the end shows participation through May of 2011, but I think even since May, the numbers have continued to go up. and we're talking almost 46 million people participating in the SNAP program right now. The second category here are the nutrition and food safety research and extension activities, and this category has been created a lot of agencies. Biggest one, or one of them, is certainly at the Department of Agriculture at just over $500 million a year, and the intramural research program at the Agricultural Research Service is the biggest single source. The Food and Drug Administration, primarily the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, or CFSAN, accounts for about $830 million. National Institute of Health spends about $1.3 billion, and I include in that category what they describe as nutrition research and training. And then the Centers for Disease Control spends about $970 million on research on chronic disease prevention. And a lot of that is dietary related, so I thought it was appropriate to include in this category as well. And then finally in this category are the International Food Assistance Programs. These are operated out of two agencies in the government, the U.S. Agency for International Development and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. USAID is the Title II Food for Peace program, which involves donation of U.S. commodities overseas to address both humanitarian and development needs. About $1.9 billion a year over the last several years, and this program has been around a long time, since 1954. And then a much smaller and more recent program, which is called the Emergency Food Security Program, or EFSP, and they use cash grants to enable local procurement or use of food vouchers in situations where there's emergency need for food, but there's ample food in the area for them to actually procure it locally. And this has only been around for about a year and a half. It was introduced in April 2010. And then at the Department of Agriculture, there are three programs. First one on the slide is the McGovern-Dole International Food for Education and Child Nutrition Program, which provides food to help bring children into schools in developing countries, especially girls. And it's averaged about $158 million a year. Relatively new program. It's been around since 2002. And the Food for Progress program, which provides donated food. Some of that is monetized or sold to generate cash for complementary activities to encourage interest and or expansion of free enterprise in developing countries, especially in emerging markets. And this is just under $200 million a year. It's been around since 1985. And then finally, a small pilot program that's part of the last Farm Bill to take a look at the effectiveness of local and regional procurement. And this provided $60 million to study the effectiveness of this approach. I think they have projects in maybe 23 countries, and they just finished the projects and are now undertaking the analysis of the data from that work. So hopefully they'll have it available for consideration in the upcoming Farm Bill. And here is a chart that breaks down the spending under this category. And the biggest category is the blue over on the right, which is the SNAP program, which is just over 60% of the total. And then the second biggest is child nutrition, the green slice over on the left, is about 19%. And then other nutrition programs, which is primarily WIC, is about 8%. And then smaller categories, the others, the research, the food aid, and the food safety and quality are much smaller categories. And then the final category spending is under GREE goal number 3, which is intended, those programs intended to promote opportunities for rural communities to succeed economically. And the programs in this category that I was able to identify were rural economic development, including renewable energy, rural infrastructure, including both housing and utilities, renewable energy research and development, international agricultural development, and then rural development and research and extension. Rural economic development category, these programs consist largely of competitive grants and loans for projects to help either open or expand rural businesses in the U.S. A lot of programs in this category. Larger among them are the business and industry loans, or BNI loans, which has a program level of about $900 million. Much smaller program is the Value-Added Producer Grant Program, which provides essentially startup money for new efforts that involve producers or cooperatives. It's about $20 million a year. Rural Cooperative Development Grants is a small program at $5.5 billion, and it actually got zeroed out in the 2011 budget, so I don't know what kind of future that one has. Forest Service has a fair amount of activities which are intended to help with the sustainable management of forest resources and also help create jobs through enhancing recreational activities. It's about $540 million. And then NRCS, the totals for this across all the U.S. agencies are about $3.8 billion. Renewable energy programs and activities. Most of these resources are developed towards, devoted towards developing new feedstocks, primarily biomass or cellulosic material for biofuels, because I think most people consider use of corn and soybean oil to be pretty mature technologies at this point. The major programs in this category include such things as the biorefinery loans and grants at the Department of Energy, which is about $200 million over the last 5 years. Biofuels programs and development at USDA, about 186, and then the Biomass Crop Assistance Program, or BCAP, which the Farm Service Agency runs, which is a new program added in the 08 Farm Bill, is about $150 million a year. And then the biofuels projects are also eligible for the general rural development loan and grant programs. Next category is the category of rural infrastructure, and this consists of the Rural Housing Service, about $11 billion in loan levels, $1.7 billion in budgetary costs, and this addresses both single and multi-unit housing, and also farm labor housing and community facilities, and it provides both construction funds and housing vouchers to help families meet the cost of housing. Next category is the programs under the Rural Utility Service, $8.5 billion in loan level, $720 million in budgetary costs, and this includes things like electricity, rural electrification, if you want to go back to the beginning of this process, provides telecom and broadband services in rural areas, and also improving water and sewage facilities. I wish I could tell you how much to spend on things like roads and bridges, but I couldn't figure out a way to break that funding out between rural and urban. And obviously there's a lot of money spent on transportation improvement across the country, but it's hard to figure out what actually goes into rural infrastructure. Next category is that of international agricultural development, and this includes activities across a lot of U.S. government agencies. The funding has seen a really big upswing in the last few years after we experienced the food price crisis of 2007-2008, and in the last 5 years the average has been about $1.4 billion. The agencies involved have been the USAID is the lead agency for the Feed the Future program, which is focused on ag development. About $570 million on average. The relatively new Millennium Challenge Corporation, which provides fairly substantial amounts of money to developing countries, and in a lot of countries, a lot of the money is being spent on rural infrastructure. So that's in this category. Department of Agriculture has relatively modest spending in this area. It's only about $62 million a year. And then we have contributions to multilateral institutions, the biggest of which is this new World Bank Global Ag Food Security Program, or GASP, which we are committed to provide $500 or $600 million to. And that's essentially, we provided funding to the World Bank to allocate on a multilateral basis. And this last chart is, again, a pie chart breakdown of the various categories in this area. The light blue chart, light blue slice on the left is economic development, about 46%. Rural housing, about 21%. Is the yellow slice. International ag development, about 17%. Rural utilities and renewable energy, much smaller categories. And then this final chart looks at across the board of all three goal areas to look at where the spending goes. And obviously the yellow, which is the nutrition spending, goal number 2, dominates both of them. But it's a little bit smaller share when you look at program levels, because none of the nutrition programs are loan programs. And so its share across all three categories falls off when you look at it that way. But we're talking about, depending on whether you're looking at outlays or program levels, either $120 billion a year spent on agriculture or about $150 billion. Seems like a big number, but keep in mind this is less than 4% of the federal budget. Okay, the next category, the next set of issues I want to talk about is look at some of these specific programs and who actually benefits and participates in them. And don't you love the nice cows here? First one is the direct payment program, which, if the reports in the press are true, is actually going away in the next Farm Bill, but for now it's a pretty major program. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's about $4.9 billion a year, so it's a big chunk of money. Eligibility is that farmers can receive this payment if they cultivate land that was part of the farm programs 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Pays off of a fixed base. Fixed yield does not actually require farmers to grow a specific crop. Demographics of this program, according to a survey that is conducted at the Economic Research Service, the three largest farm categories, which are essentially farms with more than $250,000 a year in revenue, accounted for 74% of all direct payments over the last 3 years, and they only account for 12% of all the farms. So pretty skewed in terms of distribution. Among the three smaller farm classes, and these are ERS definitions, which are retirement, residential/lifestyle, and then farming low sales, which is farms with sales under $100,000. Only 14% of them collected any direct payments in 2007 through 2009. And frankly, as long as farm support payments are directly linked to crop production, either past or current, you're going to get the same sort of skewed distribution, because that's just sort of the way the math works. And this chart shows which states are the major recipients of direct payments under this program. And the darker colors are those states that get the larger amounts. So you're looking at Midwest states like Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, Missouri, Texas, Arkansas, all get a fair amount of money under this program, because this is essentially where the major crops, which are corn, wheat, soybeans, rice, cotton, that's where they're grown, and so that's where the money goes. Next program I want to talk about is the Federal Crop Insurance Program. This program provides subsidized, actuarially sound, either yield or revenue insurance to farmers. And it's actually available to cover more than 100 crops, so this is pretty broad, even though the crops that are actually covered under the program, most of them, the acres and most of the value of the program is for corn, wheat, and soybeans, because those are the biggest crops in terms of acreage. And there's also limited availability of coverage for livestock revenue under the program. The program requires farmers to engage in good farming practice in order to be eligible for indemnities under the program, and there are no other restrictions, nothing like payment limitations, which you'll find in some of the other programs. In 2009, according to the ARM survey, 16% of respondents had insured acres under the program. Why is it so small? Because if a farmer, the only thing he does is livestock, there's no reason for him to have crop insurance, because he doesn't have a marketable crop. But 50 to 63% of farmers in the economic classes with sales of more than 100,000 participated in the program. So the bigger the farm was, the likelier they were to participate in crop insurance. Much lower participation for farmers with smaller sales. And between regions, you saw much higher participation in northern plains states than you did in regions like Appalachia. And here's a map that shows where the states are, what states have large amounts of acres insured under the program. And again, the darker, the blues and purples are the states with the higher participation rates. And same states as you saw in the last graph at the top of the list, which are Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, North Dakota, Texas, are very, very strong participants in the program. And part of that is because, again, we're talking about crops which are dominated by the program crops, and crops in other parts of the country have policies available to them, but not as broadly subscribed as the main program crops. Next one I want to describe is the Farm Service Agency Direct Loan Program. FSA loans directly to farmers that have an acceptable credit history but have been unable to get loans from commercial bankers. These kinds of loans can be used to pay for annual purchases of inputs, such as seeds and fertilizer, which are known as operating loans, or they can be used to purchase farmland or farm structures or repair existing structures. These are known as ownership loans. Under law, you cannot exceed a loan of more than $300,000 a year under either category. According to the ARM survey, less than 2% of respondents in 2009 actually used this program. You saw higher participation among full-time farmers with sales greater than $250,000, but it's still less than 10%. Among regions, the highest participation was in the lake states, which is like Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, but there it was only 3.5%. And it's a good question, is why is that so low? I think it's because a lot of farmers use other programs. There's a similar program that's a guaranteed loan program, where a farmer gets a loan from a commercial bank that is then guaranteed by USDA. And so there's a fair amount of farmers who use that exclusively. And then there's a fair amount of farmers who don't have to rely on USDA at all and deal only with the commercial lenders. And then with improved farm prices and income in recent years, there's a fair amount of farmers who can self-finance their operating expenses, so they don't need that kind of credit at all. It's been relatively good the last couple of years in terms of farm income in the U.S. Next set of programs I want to describe are the land retirement programs. The biggest one is the Conservation Reserve, which has been around since the 1985 Farm Bill. It's aimed at idling highly erodible land for 10 or 15 years. Under current law, it's capped at 32 million acres. I think we're probably going to see a reduction in that cap as part of the budget savings that the Ag Committee has offered to the Super Committee, although we haven't actually seen that draft legislation yet. All farmland is eligible for the CRP, but it must meet a threshold of providing environmental benefits and to be accepted. They have a bid, an auction system essentially that they use to establish who gets payments under CRP. According to the ERS ARMS database, 16% of all farms surveyed participated in a land retirement program, average payment of about $5,100. This is interesting. Participation is fairly uniform across farm size categories, and that's kind of unique under farm programs. The highest participation is for farms with receipts between $250,000 and $500,000, and the lowest is 15% for farms with receipts less than $100,000. So you don't see as much variability across demographic categories or economic categories in this program as you do in a lot of the others. And this map shows you where the CRP acres are located as of a couple months ago, July 2011. And similarly, you see a lot of the same states highlighted in the darker colors as you did, although it's a little bit further west. I would say the focus, more of the states in the Great Plains like Texas and Kansas and North Dakota and Montana are the brown, the darker colors, and still pretty high, but not as high in the Great Plains in Iowa, Illinois, Missouri. But still, you're seeing this in the same sort of core set of states. The other category of environmental programs that I like to refer are the working land programs. And that essentially means that you're paying a farmer to maintain a practice on farmland that's still being cultivated. And the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, or EQIP, is the largest of these programs. And it's available to farmers to insist in the adoption of a conservation practices, typo's still there, on their operations. Under law, 60% of the money under EQIP has to go to livestock farms. And that was a total of $1.2 billion in 2010. Cost share is required. The money is allocated to the state level and then sent to farmers from the state conservation's office. Under the 2009 survey, 3% of all farmers received payments from one of the working land programs with the average payment of $9,400 a year. Participation in the programs was highest among the largest farm class, about 12%, and lowest for farms with less than $100,000 in receipts, and that was only about 2%. So you're back to that same skewed distribution with the working lands program that you didn't see so much with the retirement programs. And here's a map with where those EQIP acres are. And because of the requirement that 60% of the program has to go to livestock farmers, you see a lot more of the EQIP money going to states that have large beef operations in the West. And so you see Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Montana, California being major participants in this program, and much less in the Plain states, which don't have the expansive livestock operations that the West does. Next program I want to talk about is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which used to be known as the Food Stamp Program. This assistance is provided to farmers below a certain income threshold, and that threshold varies depending on your household size. For example, for a family of 4, that amounts to an annual gross income of $28,000 in last fiscal year. According to the data available for the Food and Nutrition Service, 79% of the households that receive SNAPs have either a child or an elderly disabled person as part of that household. About half of the SNAP beneficiaries are children under the age of 18. The average SNAP household has monthly gross income of $711, and then that's supplemented by SNAP benefits of about $270. 78% of SNAP households lived in metropolitan areas in fiscal 2009. And here's a map that shows you where the high participation states are for the SNAP program. And there are some ones you kind of expect to see because you see a big slice of the Appalachian country states have pretty high SNAP participation. And then, of course, you know, Michigan has had real problems with its economy lately, so you're not surprised to see that one be relatively high. But I'm not quite sure why Oregon and New Mexico and Maine are on this list, and it's kind of a puzzle to me, but that's where the numbers were. These are 2 years old, so they may have changed a little bit, but I think they're still pretty reliable. Another program I want to describe is the Business and Industry, or BNI, Guaranteed Loan Program. And this one finances business and industry acquisition, construction, conversion, expansion, and repair for businesses in rural areas. A long list of eligible entities. A borrower may be a cooperative, can be a corporation, a partnership, or other legal entity, can be an Indian tribe, or a public body, or an individual. So almost about everybody. In fiscal 2009, USDA estimated that $1.1 billion in loans under this program provided 17,000 jobs. And under the Stimulus Act, with $101.6 billion in additional funds, it's estimated the program created or saved another 35,000 jobs in fiscal 2009 and 10. There was no break out of loan fund data between entity types that I could find. This map shows you where the states that got BNI loans were, and it's quite a bit different distribution than we've seen with some of the other programs. They're not so much centered in the Midwest and West, more sort of along the periphery of the country. So big participation in California, Oregon, up in the Great Lakes states, Michigan, Wisconsin, some in New England and New York and Pennsylvania, and then Tennessee and Georgia. So quite a bit different distribution for this program than for a lot of the others we've looked at. Another program I want to look at here is the Rural Energy for America, or the REAP program. This was established in the 2002 Farm Bill and extended in the 2008 Farm Bill. The purpose of the program is to fund energy audits and renewable energy development assistance, and it also can be used to purchase and install renewable energy systems and make energy efficiency improvements. So it's a kind of a unique program. It's available to farmers, ranchers, and rural businesses, and had $49 million provided under this program in fiscal 2010. And here are the states where you see a lot of these programs. And if you can see the numbers, and they are kind of small, the number in Iowa is about 3 times bigger than any other state. And it's a little hard to explain except if you know the personalities involved. And this was the program that came into being when Tom Harkin, senator from Iowa, was chair of this committee. And he has very good staff who know how to help people apply for this program. So I think that's part of the reason why you see a lot more REAP money in Iowa than you do other states. But that's just my opinion. I worked for him, but I didn't work on this program. Slight disclaimer there. And then the last category, I think, the category of USDA research grants. And these are external grants that are allocated by the newly renamed Agriculture and Food Research Institute, or AFRI, at the Department of Agriculture. The grants are awarded after a competitive peer review process. They had $262 million available to be obligated in fiscal 2011, and contrast that to the formula funds that provided $573 million in the same year. For fiscal 2011, the projects were granted mostly to land-grant universities, accounted for 77 of the total, followed by researchers at other public universities, and then private universities and federal agencies and labs, much smaller amounts. And here's, again, the distribution by states of where these grants went. And a little bit different array. You see California, Texas, Florida, Iowa, Washington State being relatively high in terms of higher numbers under that. And part of that is due to the fact that these are states which have big agriculture, but also pretty good land-grant universities that have the personnel, the research people who are good at writing grant proposals, apparently. Oh, not the last category. The last category is the International Food Assistance Programs. Biggest one is the Title II Food for Peace program, largest and oldest of them. The bulk of the expenditures go to address emergency humanitarian needs. Last estimate I got is that they had spent about $400 million on relief in the Horn of Africa thus far this year, and numbers probably a bit higher than that by this point. So they tend to respond where the real disasters are. 2008 Farm Bill required that a set share of Title II funding be set aside for the ag development non-emergency programs. In fiscal 2010, Title II assistance went to about 27 of the world's poorest countries, and that's countries that have per capita incomes of about $500 or less. And this map shows you where these countries are. And it's a small map, I recognize that, but you can see pretty clearly by the dramatic color changes is that most of these are in Africa. Couple in Central America, South America, and then a handful in Asia, but the biggest recipients under this program are sub-Saharan Africa. And then the last topic I want to talk about is what are prospects for the future for U.S. ag spending? What are some of the competing visions out there for where we're going in terms of budgetary reform? And the first entry in this category was what was put together by the President's Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. This was chaired by former Senator Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, who was the White House Chief of Staff under President Clinton. This process was completed late December of 2010. If it were to be implemented, they assert that it would have achieved nearly $4 trillion in deficit reduction within 10 years. It would have been a mixture of spending cuts, about 25% from mandatory programs, about $1 trillion from revenue savings, and then almost $700 million by interest savings. In terms of farm programs, they would have proposed $10 billion in net savings from farm programs, including they would have put more money towards disaster assistance programs, so the net would be different from the gross. It mentioned cuts in direct payments and the EQIP program, CSP, and the market access program as potential sources of savings. When the president set up this commission, he said that they needed to have 14 of the 18 members support the package in order to receive an automatic vote on the package, and they only got 11 votes. So it didn't have any sort of official standing, but it sort of was the first entry into this process. Second entry into this process was the fiscal 2012 budget proposal, which is known by some as the Ryan Plan because Paul Ryan is the chairman of the House Budget Committee. This budget resolution passed the House on a party line vote in April of this year, was rejected by the Senate that following month, so it never became the official budget resolution of Congress. They claim to have cut spending by $5.8 trillion over 10 years. The biggest savings item would have shifted the burden of cost of the Medicare program to future seniors, those who are currently under 55. It would have cut taxes, another $4.2 trillion over 10 years. In terms of the farm program cuts, they proposed $30 billion in cuts to farm programs, and additional $18 billion in cuts to conservation programs. But where they would have taken a really big hit was the SNAP, the food stamp program. They wanted to block grant the program and make it no longer an entitlement program and impose much higher eligibility on the program, and cutting the funding by $127 billion over 10 years. Another plan that's been put out there is by a group that was known in the Senate as the Gang of Six. This is 6 senators, 3 from each side of the aisle, who sat down and struggled and came up with recommendations. They released their plan in late July of this year. They claim a total deficit reduction of $3.7 trillion over the next 10 years. This would have been a 2-step plan. The down payment of $500 billion was fairly specific in terms of what items they would go after. And then beyond that, they would have given specific instructions to the various committees to find more spending cuts and then also to the House Ways and Means and Finance Committee to find another $1 trillion in net revenue increases. The Gang of Six plan would have included cuts of $11 billion for farm programs while having no changes in SNAP. The reason that I say they claim total reductions is because I don't think any of these plans actually ever were officially scored by CBO. So you don't ever know until you get an official score as to what the formal assessment is. And so a lot of them had numbers which they thought they could achieve, but none of them, I don't think, ever got the official imprimatur of the Congressional Budget Office. President Obama, in the last couple of months, came up with a new deficit reduction plan, which he sent to Congress on September 19th. This would have included $33 billion in cuts to the agricultural baseline over the next 10 years. Those cuts would have been primarily from eliminating the direct payments, further reducing subsidies for crop insurance, both those to companies and to producers, and then adjustments to better target conservation programs. This chart sort of shows you what the evolution of the composition of spending has been over the last several decades. Back in 1940, there were no food stamp programs, so what you had was just farm program spending, and it accounted for almost 4% of the total federal budget. And then you started getting the food stamp program in there. 1970 was like this, only the second or third year of the program, so it's still being dominated by farm program spending. And then you get into the 80s and you start to see a more even distribution in 2000, and then boom, you get to 2010. And it's a combination of the fact that you have a very poor economy, so you have increased spending under food stamps or SNAP, and you have very high commodity prices, so you have very much reduced spending for the farm program, and that's how you got that reversal in that pattern. So what do we know from what's going on right now as to what the future direction of this process might be? And you can take some hints from what's going on in the appropriations process. Fiscal 2012 appropriation bills have not been completed yet, but both the House and Senate have sort of worked their wills, and now it's to figure out how to reconcile them. But one of the reasons there are differences between these is that the House used the budget numbers from the Ryan plan, which would have had very significant cuts for fiscal 2012, but the Senate used the figure that was established in the Budget Control Act, which is about $35 billion higher than it would have been for fiscal 2011. And so House Ag Approach cuts a total of $2.7 billion for fiscal 12 as compared to fiscal 11. This includes a 10% reduction in the WIC program, 14% reduction in rural development and ag research, 11.5% for the Food and Drug Administration, and a very major 30% cut in the food aid program. And then you look at the Senate Ag Approach numbers, and they have a much lower overall cut, and then they have very different kind of priorities assigned here. Only a 2% cut in WIC, 2% increase in FDA, because they recognize that with the passage of the Food Safety Modernization Act last year, that these agencies have additional responsibilities, so they needed more money. 2% decrease in ag research funding, and then a very small, but certainly large compared to the cut for the Title II food program of 4%. We're currently operating under a continuing resolution for fiscal 12, which expires a week from Friday, so not a lot of time. I think what's very likely is they're going to maybe get a couple of bills done, and then they'll do a CR for another month or so. Where do things stand right now for the 2012 Farm Bill, and it's very much tied up with what's going on with the super committee process. I see three possible outcomes for that super committee process. One is they'll actually reach a deal to cut $1.5 trillion or more over the next 10 years. One possibility is that a stalemate will occur. They'll get no deal whatsoever, and you'll get all the full sequestration process kick in. And then the third possibility, which I kind of think is the most likely one, is that they'll get a partial deal. They'll get, several $100 billion in cuts, but they won't get to the $1.2 trillion. And so we'll go get cuts under super committee and cuts under sequestration. But they have until November 23rd to figure out which of those three is going to happen. If we actually end up with sequestration, 54% of the current ag-related spending is protected. That includes the SNAP program, child nutrition, WIC, and CRP. So a fair amount of what they do is protected under that process. Estimates I've seen is that the cuts under sequestration for ag would be $14 or $15 billion over the next 10 years. House and Senate Ag Committee chair and ranking members sent a joint letter to the Super Committee about 3 weeks ago in which they proposed the net cuts of $23 billion over 10 years. They were promising to provide policy details by November 1st. They have not yet done so. My sense is that they're really struggling to reach an agreement over what to do. I think they've agreed to cut direct payments. They haven't figured out what they're going to put in its place yet, and that's why there's no public release yet. This is part of an effort would be to include a very significant part of the next Farm Bill in this Super Committee legislation. Of course, they don't have that done yet, and even if they do finish it, there are no guarantees that the Super Committee process is going to work, so they could still end up with having to do a full Farm Bill next year. There are some specific ideas out there that I think is in the mix in terms of what the commodity title might look at. There's something called the Aggregate Risk and Revenue Management Program, which is put forward by 4 senators, Dick Durbin from Illinois, Sherrod Brown from Ohio, John Thune from South Dakota, and Dick Lugar from Indiana. This would build on the current average crop revenue or acre program. It would eliminate the current direct, countercyclical, and SURE programs and establish a crop revenue safety net based not on the state level income, which it does right now, but instead on a crop reporting district, which is essentially a subset of counties in a given state. So, for example, in Iowa, there are 99 counties and 9 crop reporting districts, so an average of 11 counties per CRD. So it's intermediate between doing it at the state level and doing it at the individual farm level. This would simplify access to the program and administration of the program, and CBO apparently believes that this legislation would save about $20 billion as compared to the current array of programs. And from what I hear, this is certainly in the mix is what's being considered for the commodity title. Where will we see the cuts focus in this process? I think everything is going to be on the table. Even if we end up with sequestration and the nutrition programs are protected from sequestration, doesn't mean they're protected from the Farm Bill, because that's a separate kind of authority. The omnibus from last year and the FY12 appropriation bills send a very clear signal that nutrition programs, both domestic and international, could well be targeted for severe cuts in the House Farm Bill. I think Senate is likely to be more protective of those programs. Public reports suggest the proposed Ag Committee cuts will occur in the following categories: $14 to $15 billion in cuts in commodity programs, 6 or so from conservation programs, and 4 or 5 billion from nutrition programs. But this is what's been reported, but there's no public agreement yet on that. So currently, the dominance of the nutrition program spending, it's roughly 2/3 of what is going on right now, is due to a combination of factors. The continuing economic problems and slow job growth has led to higher social safety net spending, and that includes both SNAP and the child nutrition programs. And then on this sort of the downside is we're seeing high crop prices due to bad weather. Increasing biofuels demand has decreased net farm program spending. So you're seeing an increase in one and a decrease in the other, and so the gap has been much expanded in the last few years.